Well, welcome to the Sunday recap on our Vine Talks podcast. My name is Dre Clark, and I'm one of the pastors here. And I'm joined today with Kelli Lawrence, who serves as our women's minister here at the church. So, Kelli, thanks so much for being here.
So excited.
Great message yesterday, Mother's Day message,
Yes.
and it was such a meaningful message to mothers, and even me as a father and as a male and as a dad, kind of sitting
Yes.
there. Very applicable. A lot of principles that I can apply right directly to my life. And so, why don't you go ahead and just tell everybody about yesterday and where you went?
For sure. I'm glad that it was applicable to all, because most importantly it was to me. God spoke really dramatically to me through this story, Esther. And when I began to study, when the pastor asked me to speak on Esther, I just read the account over and over. And I kept coming upon this verse that said, how can I bear to see the destruction of my family? Esther said those words, and I thought, now that is how she relates to me as a mom, as a grandmother, as a woman, an influential woman. And so from that birthed this thing that God taught me, which was that we all have some sort of family as women, because it was a celebration of women, not just moms. He said all women have some kind of family, even if it's not biology.
I love that.
You know, and then went on to say that Esther had this really powerful, strong, mean, horrible enemy in the man of Haman, and he was out to destroy her and her people. And he was strong and powerful, and he had all authority. And so we too, as women of God, of women of influence, we too have an enemy. And we just, we dove in that just the slightest amount and talked about the fact that
you had a couple of D's around that.
Yes,
too.
I actually did get those from JP's book. Your story has a villain, and great book. I highly recommend it. And he just really got into that whole subject of just being reminded that we've got to recognize the enemy around us, and that can be through something really bad like deceit, but it can also be something sort of simple like distraction. So we talked about our enemy, then we talked about just the fact that our God is providential, that God's in charge of everything. And while we may think that we're so powerful and have such influence, that's true. We get to choose, because at one point Esther was faced with this question, well, you can remain silent if you want, her cousin Mordecai said to her, or you can, and if you do, somebody else will rise up. Or
He's
you
in
can
charge
choose.
Still.
You can choose.
So do you want to be a part?
Yeah, exactly. I love that part, because it's like God's going to accomplish what he sets out to, And then lastly, and kind of where we kind of just camped for a little bit, was that Esther chose to become a fighting warrior for the people that she was influencing, for her family. And she pleads before the king. And she does this thing that we as believers in Christ can do all day, every day, morning, noon, night. We can plead before our king on behalf of our family and say to him, how can I let the destruction of my family be? Lord, please hear me, hear my cry, move, and rescue us. So
I love
that's
it.
kind of the message.
It's great. I mean, I think you're pointing on two major things. One, I don't know if you're doing this, realizing this or not. One of the biggest themes of Scripture really is this idea of family loyalty.
Yes.
I mean, from especially the Old Testament and then the New Testament kind of pieces this together in a beautiful way. But that is huge. And really, it's reflecting the loyalty that God has for us. And so there's a lot of things. I mean, Esther has a bunch of characters in this story that are people of their times. They're not perfect. I mean, if you read the story, as you read the story, you're like,
actually, it'll blow your mind just a tiny bit.
Yeah, you're like,
the details.
But in the midst of sometimes disobedience, in the midst of a corrupt culture, and even some corrupt thinking, she gets one thing right. She finds that one thing, and then she pursues that one thing. And there's this pivotal moment of, okay, I know this is where God's doing.
And
I know this is where he's at.
And what I love about her getting this one thing right is that she recognizes that God will accomplish his plans, with or without her. But she chooses to participate. And that is kind of the beauty of the fact that she becomes this warrior for her people.
No, I love it. I've always taught people, there's a lot of times in our life where you just don't know what God's calling you to, but if you can see that one light, if you can say, I know God's in this, I just know that God's there, run to that. And you're normally a pretty safe bet, because God is doing something. God is always, and normally he's doing the same thing. It's this idea of redemption and restoration, and like I said, family loyalty. So.
Well, and that was something we talked about yesterday, that his redemption story started, has a starting and has an ending. And his purposes will be accomplished.
That's right.
You know? So anyway, it was just really cool to look at Esther through those eyes and look at her more as an influential woman who protected her family. So
which is we could spend a whole other time on just that topic, right?
Exactly.
Before we go down my rabbit trails, I want to know, as you're preparing, I know that you were faithful. You even mentioned you read this story over and over again. There's got to be a lot of things that to present this in a message on Mother's Day. There's got to be some stuff you skip. So was there anything that if you had another 10 minutes that you would have pressed in a little bit more on this story?
Yeah, I mean, my heart was for women and turned towards women totally in this whole thing. But there's this beautiful story of the man Mordecai, who's the cousin to Esther. Actually, I could tell you about 5 things I feel like I left on the table, because the whole idea of the enemy, there was so much we could talk about for weeks on that. But Mordecai is this incredibly faithful man, and he's sitting at the gates, and we don't have time to go into all the details, but he instructs his cousin Esther. He raised her, and he instructs her along the way, and he's always there for her. It's so beautiful. Every single time you can see all the way through the story, he wants to protect the king because his life has been threatened. So he sends word to Esther. I mean, he's constantly sending word to her and taking care of this beautiful female in his life. And I think there's a story there. I think that, for men, that there's this idea of protection, and we kind of lose that a little bit in our society, maybe.
Even this idea of that family loyalty and advocating for you can't advocate unless you know what advocacy looks like. And this is a deeply Christian concept. We love because he loved us. And so you look kind of at these this moment. I think every good story has this. Everybody has this person who comes to your life that's going to set you up. And so you see this picture of amazing what this woman does. But he's that
behind
stability
her,
behind the scenes.
Whisper.
That's right.
She has a whisper of a human being. We know we have the still small voice, right, with the Holy Spirit, but she has this human being speaking to her and is reminding her of the providence of God, and reminding her that she could be called to protect her people right in this moment.
We haven't even hit the fact that one of the blatant things in the book of Esther is that the Lord, God, is not mentioned. And so, but he's very, and so it's almost like everything's kind of, in this post-exilic period, everything's kind of the desert land. It's like, where is God? But there is this still small voice through this faithful man.
That's exactly
who's speaking into it, and then that's all it takes.
And we know that he's so present too because of what Mordecai does. And it's another thing that our faith is seen in how we live, And so anyway.
Whole other sermon there. I'm gonna write that down in my notes.
Father's Day.
Father's Day.
That for
Let's
Father's
just teach
Day.
I love that. That's great. Well, Kelli, I want one more question for you. And so, once again, so much that we could cover here. But we're talking about this idea of family, talking about the idea that there's an enemy, talking about this idea of participating. And you had this really powerful moment where I could just see your passion leaking out. But you were, encouraging, us in the room to say, if you have an opportunity today, you do have this opportunity, this privilege today to plea before your King on behalf of your family. So this idea of going to God and pleading and getting on our knees for our family. And I want to ask just a very practical follow-up question, because I feel like that's something that's really resonates with a lot of people. But whenever it gets down to our feet on the ground, family in our world is often kind of broken, and maybe we have split families, or maybe we don't have part of our family this day of the week and we have this part, or maybe we're dealing with in-laws and other people. And then even beyond that, Esther, of course, she's doing this on behalf of the family of people, the family of God. So how do we functionally walk through that as we plead with God and as we ask God, okay, what is my influence today? Like, is it just immediate family? Is it just my kids? Is it just my spouse? How do we parse that out in our real life?
Well, I first will say always immediate families is the beginning, right? That
start
is
the
beginning. Start. You start at the start, exactly. And immediate family, of course, I'm in a different season than you are. My kids are raised. I now have grandkids. And so things look differently. I don't know all the details of my grown-up kids in their lives. I do plead before the King on behalf of them. I do desperately try to recognize the enemy when he might be coming into our family and trying to destroy even that extended family unit. But because of the season that I'm at, I think that's a very important question for me, because my family is much wider
Yeah.
than it felt
Yeah.
when I was young. Because I think we define that word family, I would define it as my level of influence.
Yeah.
You know, and my calling
Yeah.
is outside of my immediate family.
Yeah, that's right. It's good.
My calling, and even yours with young children, our calling is outside of the people that we live with.
Yeah.
And
It's not less than.
No,
But
no.
oftentimes it's more.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that family, you know, looking at our church family yesterday, I was like, these are your people that you can plead to the Father on behalf. Now, some of them you know, and some of them you don't. So, little bit of a hierarchy, right, when it comes to pleading for people. And placing people before the Lord, but recognizing that we have a sphere of influence of people, and that's not always biology.
Yeah, I love that. We talk at our Discover First, our membership class. We talk about spheres of influence.
Yes.
And you have a work family. Like we talk about this. Like you have a work. You've got your home. You've got where you live, work, and play. You've got all these spheres that God places us in. I think it's a very New Testament Jesus question. Who's my neighbor?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's important to recognize that God has placed us in these spheres to be these
100%.
advocates. Now you're right. That doesn't mean that we sacrifice our immediate.
Right.
It's a both and
Right.
there's different times of prioritization.
Right.
But I think once we start to embrace this isn't just about me and taking care of my kids and just so we can have amazing vacations
Right,
and we can have just this amazing life for us. I think you almost fail as a family at that point because you're not teaching your family to look outside the family, which is what families are meant to do.
And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a young parent today. That is a challenge to say, because we kind of live in a culture where protecting our family is at utmost priority. And honestly, God never instructs us to do that.
Yeah.
He didn't have to. He also doesn't say love your kids really because he knows we will.
It's kind of default.
But the calling that he does say is teach them about me. And so in doing that, we have to reach outside of our family. Yeah. Our families have to see us have influence in other places, right? So,
and that changes. What you said earlier, you're in a different season than I am, and so that's changing as we continue to move throughout our lives.
Yes.
But there's still this precedent of figure out what spheres that God has given you in that season, and work with what you got.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Start at the start.
Exactly. There's not a woman that I could talk to today that can't relate to Esther saying the very words that she said before the king.
Yeah.
I can't stand by. Yeah. I see the destruction of my family. Maybe it's not immediate family. Yeah. Maybe it's the culture.
But that's how we know.
Church,
that's how we know whenever it's something that I can't stand by. If you find those I can't stand by moments, that's where maybe you should start leaning into and start
before the king.
Before the king. And that's the step. It's awareness and it's going before God. It's not I'm going to dedicate my entire life to this right now.
Yes.
But it's you go before the king and see what have you do.
Yeah. That's really a beautiful lesson. And I guess I just never looked at Esther in that way as a family woman. I always knew of Queen Esther, but now I have a new view.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful.
Protected her family.
Yeah, it's not often taught that way.
No.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that out in the text.
And
I think that was wonderful. I think it's very applicable. I think it's very biblical and meaningful. So
wow, it was
thank you for being faithful with it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And
absolutely.
We're looking forward to next time we get to hear you speak.
Yeah,
of course, you do a lot of stuff on campus.
Yes.
So if anybody listening wants to come and sit, we've got women's events happening all summer.
Yes.
We've got different groups, and so they can go to the website and then get connected and plugged in with women's ministry. So.
Yeah, lots of community happening around here with women.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you, listeners.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we hope that you'll join us in person. We're continuing this series from the Creator to Christ, this divine narrative. So join us back next week. And of course, if you miss us in service at 10:30, you can be back next week to listen to the podcast on the Sunday recap. Thanks so much for listening. Y'all have a good one.